On tonight's episode of Mr. Norris's In Case You Missed It, we're going to talk about Southern slavery and the plantation lifestyle. We'll talk about how cotton became king and exactly how slavery functioned and operated in the Deep South. Hey, hi, hello, and what is up, everybody? It's your host, Mr. Norris, the history teacher with the good hair. And tonight we're going to be talking about Southern slavery and the plantation lifestyle system. Pretty heavy topic, but definitely one that is super important, especially as you get closer and closer to the Civil War in U.S. History 1. All right, first let's start with how cotton became king in the South, because you can't get to plantations in the plantation system without that. Prior to the early 1790s, cotton really wasn't something that was grown widespread in the South. There were cash crops in the South, such as indigo, tobacco, and cotton. But cotton probably was the least popular of those. The reason being is that cotton is extremely tough to produce. When you grow cotton, the flowering part of the cotton plant, the white puffy part that we use for clothing and other fabrics, contains a lot of seeds inside of it. And it's an extremely time-consuming process to sit there and pull and sift all of these seeds out of the cotton. So it was tough to produce, hence it's tough to ship out and make money off of. So not a lot of people are interested in growing it or selling it. That all changes in 1793 when a man from the North named Eli Whitney invents the cotton engine, or the cotton gin for short. And basically what it is, it's a very simple machine with kind of like a hand crank system and a wheel inside. And on the wheel, there's metal spikes and then little holes. And you drop, bushels full of cotton. And I assume that's the right word. I have no idea. I don't produce cotton, so I'm just go with me here. You drop in bushels of cotton and crank the wheel, and the little spikes on the wheel grab the cotton, pull it through the holes. The seeds aren't big enough to fit through these holes. They drop to the bottom, and what you have is pure, clean cotton. And what used to take 45 minutes, an hour, to do for one little flowering part of a piece of cotton, you can now do that within 10, 20, 30 seconds. Eli Whitney, when he invents this, he actually thinks it's going to help reduce slavery in the South, because now you'll need less hands to sit there and pull out the seeds. Well, his invention catches on, and he's dead wrong. It actually leads to an explosion of slavery in the South. Why? Now that cotton can be more easily produced, and it's not as big a time-staking process, more people want to grow it. And now that more people are growing it, now they need more slaves to work on their fields, work on their plantations. Hence, slavery explodes. It's estimated that in 1790, 3 years before the invention of the cotton gin, there was about 600,000 slaves in the United States in total. By 1810, about 20 years later, there's 1.2 million. Okay, so that has doubled in just 20 years. And as far as the trajectory of how slavery was increasing, it went up by 70% just because of the invention of the cotton gin. So it goes to show you that it definitely had a big impact on slavery and cotton production in Southern society. All right. Now let's get into the South and why it became so reliant on cotton. Cotton became king. It was the driving force of their economy. There's really, realistically, not that many places in the world where you can effectively grow and produce cotton. And the American South is one of the best, if not the best places in the world. At about that time in the early 1800s, nearly 2/3 of the world's cotton was produced and grown in the South. And people all over the world need to be clothed, right? And they need fabrics and different things that you make cotton with. So people are looking to buy from the South. So is the North, by the way. The North also wants the South's cotton. The North's economy back then is mostly manufacturing, and they're also making clothing and different fabrics, and they're purchasing a lot of the South's cotton. So it becomes a driving force for their economy. Even if you live in the South and you don't grow cotton or own slaves or have a plantation, you still pretty much rely on the money that gets produced and brought into the South from cotton. So as I say, cotton becomes king. Now, we often think nowadays that every single person in the South was this like plantation slave owner that had slaves as far as the eye can see and massive cotton fields. And that's just not the case. To defeat that stigma a little bit, only about 25% of people in the South own slaves. And this is from the early to mid 1800s, only about 25%. Reason being is that slaves were an expensive commodity to have to afford in the United States at that time. Of that 25%, the vast majority were small farmers in the South, didn't own plantations. They might have owned small farms where they mostly just grew and produced what their family needed to get by. They might have had a little room on that farm for some cash crop products that maybe they could sell on the side and make a little extra profit for their family. But for the most part, they're just barely making ends meet, barely getting by. And on these small farms, they might have typically owned about, anywhere between 1 and 5 slaves. Okay. Now, how was the treatment of these slaves on the small farms? That's a difficult question to answer. Kind of depends on the owner. However, most historians agree that treatment on small farms was better than it was on plantations. We're not going to go as far as to say that treatment of these slaves was good on these small farms because they're still slaves and they don't have their freedom or liberty. But they were certainly treated better on small farms than on plantations. Reason being, again, these small farm owners don't have, a great amount of capital or wealth or money. So they need to treat their slaves well, because if their slaves are injured or can't work or die, then that's going to hurt their production. They need to keep them as healthy as they possibly can. Sometimes on small farms, slaves even lived inside the household with the family. Sometimes they were considered parts of the family or members of the family, but it's still an ugly practice, right? They don't have their freedom. They don't have their liberty. Now, when we think of the horrors of slavery and the really, really awful, bad treatment of slaves, that mostly comes on plantations. About 3,000 Southerners by the time of the Civil War owned plantations or enough crops to have about 100 or more slaves. So about 3,000 people in the South. While that's not a huge number as far as the total population, keep in mind, those 3,000 people, they ruled the South. That's the ruling elite of the South. They have all the money, all of the wealth, and all of the things that Southern politicians do in order to create laws in the South and to drive law in Washington, D.C. is based on what those 3,000 men want them to do. So even though the population of massive slave owners, plantation owners was pretty small, they drove the South's economy and their political lifestyle. Politicians kind of answer to them. So that's why the South's going to want to promote things that keep slavery alive. So we have about 3,000 people in the South that own massive plantations, about 100 or more slaves. And there was a really intricate system on plantations for managing and controlling slaves and controlling their output. You would obviously have the slave master and their family, and that's the person who, owns, and we always think of this like the big white plantation house, and you got the trees. I don't know what they're called. I guess willows? I have no idea. Again, you're going to watch this later and be like, that's not it. Just go with me here. Those, droopy kind of trees. That's exactly how somebody with a brain would describe them. But you know what I'm talking about. You've seen in movies or shows before, the Southern plantations. You have the slave master and their family, and they're kind of at the top of the hierarchy on Southern plantations. Then you would have what was called an overseer. And basically what the overseer's function is it was mostly a white male that the slave master would hire in order to watch over the slaves and make sure that they're being as productive as they possibly can. The slave master, this rich, elite Southerner, is not going to go stand out in a 95-degree Georgia field all day in order to watch the slaves and make sure that they're working. He's going to pay somebody else to do that, and that's where the overseer comes into place. Now, the overseer, could they give out punishments and beatings and whippings if they thought that the slaves weren't working as hard as they possibly could have been or weren't being as productive as they possibly could have been? Yes, they absolutely had the freedom to do that. On a lot of plantations, they had the freedom to do whatever they needed to do in order to get the most cotton out, or most cotton production out of the slaves that they possibly could have. So you have the slave master, you have the overseer. Right beneath that, typically on plantations, you would have somebody called the slave driver. Now, that could be another white male that works just as the overseer's right-hand man. Because think about it, if you're on a plantation with 200 slaves, one overseer is not going to cut it. You might have to hire multiple overseers, and those overseers might have to have slave drivers working with them. Now, slave drivers could be white, but sometimes on plantations, they were actually black slaves that worked as a slave driver. And when you hear that, you might be thinking, well, why would a slave want to be a slave driver, a person that's in charge of making sure the other slaves are doing their work and possibly beating and whipping them? Yeah, that sounds like an ugly practice and something that you wouldn't want to do. But the reason why slaves would want to be slave drivers is because they were given better conditions, better living conditions. Their housing might have been a little bit better. Their clothing situation might have been a little bit better. The food situation might have been a little bit better, so on and so forth. Then, so you have the slave master, overseer, slave driver. You had house slaves who worked inside the plantation house and pretty much did things like cook, clean. They cared for the slave master's children, entertained guests when they came over. As far as the type of work they were doing, it was easier than field slaves, which we'll get to in a second. As far as like physically demanding, it was easier, but it might have been more stressful because you're in constant contact with the slave master and your owners, and any small screw up or error that you make is kind of magnified because you're right next to them. and they can see that. So definitely high stress. Typically, house slaves were more likely to be women than men, although some men did work inside the house too. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy for slave plantations, you have field slaves. And those are people that work from sun up to sundown, 6 days a week, picking cotton and producing cotton, cleaning cotton. And they're really the driving force of plantation life and plantation economy. Like I said, it's absolutely grueling, back-breaking work. And if you're not being as productive as they think that you can be, again, you're going to have these beatings, whippings, lashings that you've seen in TV and movie shows that could possibly be given out to you. And you know what? Even worse sometimes. So there you have it. Did every single Southerner own plantations? No, not by a long shot. In fact, most of them did not. Most Southerners didn't even own slaves. About 25% did. However, the 3,000 or so that own plantations, they are the ruling elite. They have all the South's money, and they dictate what gets done politically for the South. And from the the early to mid 1800s, they definitely want slavery in place, and they enjoy that they're making money off of slave labor. And while the rest of the South might not be owning plantations, they're definitely benefiting from that. And so is the North, by the way, in some cases. So there you have it. It's a complex system. It's a regrettable system for sure, but it's definitely something that we need to talk about and learn about. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, comment, or subscribe. Any of that would be just fine. Remember that history is life, and in the words of George Washington, the surest basis for public happiness is knowledge. So go out there and get some. Have a good night, everybody.